Julius Caesar did not simply change Rome. He fractured time. For centuries, nations measured their calendars, their kingdoms, and their rulers by the shockwaves he left behind. His victories redrew maps. His reforms outlived empires. His death created the world's most famous political murder. And his name itself, Caesar, became a title claimed by emperors, conquerors, and tyrants for nearly 2,000 years. But behind that immortality was a man born into a collapsing republic, shaped by trauma, held together by ambition, and destined for betrayal. This is not the story you think you know. This is the rise and fall of a Roman Colossus, told from the shadows behind his triumphs, from the blood beneath his glory, and from the fragile humanity inside a man who refused to accept the limits of fate. Before Caesar, Rome was a republic already dying. Corruption devoured the Senate. Generals built private armies. The poor rioted while the rich murdered their rivals in the streets. Foreign wars drained the treasury, and the heart of Roman politics had become a battlefield of ambition. Into this chaos stepped a young man born into an old name, a boy raised to believe that conquest, brilliance, and divinity were not privileges, but obligations. What follows is the journey of a human forged into a myth turned into a threat, and a threat transformed into a god. The birth of a rising star, Rome in crisis. Rome in 100 BCE was a cauldron at boiling point. Civil wars had scarred the city. The streets echoed with political violence between the populares, champions of the people, and the optimates, defenders of aristocratic power. Poverty spread like a plague, while the Senate clung desperately to a past already slipping through its fingers. Into this fractured world, in a modest house on the Subura hillside, Gaius Julius Caesar was born. His family wasn't rich, but they were ancient, claiming descent from the goddess Venus herself. To Romans, lineage meant destiny. Destiny meant duty. From the moment Caesar opened his eyes, Rome was in the middle of one of its greatest political storms. Gaius Marius, his uncle by marriage, had risen from common birth to become one of Rome's most decorated generals. His rivalry with the ruthless Lucius Cornelius Sulla had plunged the republic into brutal conflict. Executions, proscriptions, and purges filled the streets. Caesar's earliest memories were not of triumph or glory, but of a republic devouring its own children. These experiences would engrave into him a lesson he would never forget. Survival belonged to the bold. Rome's social fabric was just as fractured. The city was choking on the weight of slaves, migrants, soldiers, and desperate poor. Meanwhile, the aristocracy indulged in obscene luxury. Young Caesar walked daily through a city where marble palaces stood beside overcrowded tenements, where triumphal marches were followed by bread riots. In this imbalance, he saw a future mission. He would later reshape Rome not through ideology, but through the understanding that power lay with those who could command the loyalty of both the elite and the masses. Caesar's birth also occurred during a rare moment of cosmic symbolism, the dawn of a new century in Roman reckoning. Astrologers, politicians, and priests searched for omens constantly, seeing meaning in comets, bird flights, and storms. Although mythic exaggeration colored later accounts, Romans genuinely believed Caesar's lineage set him apart. Raised beneath the shadows of gods, warriors, and politicians, he was expected to do great things or die trying, and he nearly did many times. Every step of his journey began here, in a world cracking apart, ready to be rebuilt by someone who refused to accept the boundaries of ordinary men. The house of Julius, gods, myths, and expectations. The Iuli were not the richest family in Rome, or the most politically dominant, but they carried something far more potent, a mythic bloodline. For centuries, the gens Julia had claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan hero who fled a burning city and laid the spiritual foundation for Rome itself. Through Aeneas came Iulus, the boy said to be the ancestor of Julius Caesar's lineage, and through Iulus flowed the blood of Venus, the goddess of love. In a world where lineage shaped destiny, this was not just a story, it was a weapon. To be born a Julian was to be told from birth that you were a thread woven directly into the fabric of myth. Caesar grew up knowing that to live an ordinary life would be a betrayal of the expectations placed upon him by ancestors who had supposedly walked with gods. Inside the Julian household, Tradition and ambition lived side by side. Caesar's father, also named Gaius, Julius Caesar, was a respected though modest political figure. His mother Aurelia was a force of discipline and intelligence. One of the most admired matrone in Rome, Aurelia's influence was immense. She shaped Caesar's character with strictness matched by affection. Roman mothers were expected to mold their sons into citizens, but Aurelia gave him something more: control, poise, and the mastery of appearances, skills that would later define his political charisma. The house itself reflected this duality of modest means and lofty expectations. Its walls were decorated with ancestral masks, each one representing a Julian forebear who had gained enough prestige to be immortalized in the family atrium. Young Caesar passed them daily, absorbing the silent message: "Greatness is your inheritance. Do not fail us." Roman boys were raised not simply to live, but to surpass the deeds of their ancestors. In Caesar's case, this meant surpassing men who were believed to be born from gods. Religion saturated every corner of his upbringing. The Romans did not pray for forgiveness. They bargained, observed, and feared the gods' capricious will. Omens guided decisions, and rituals defined daily life. Caesar learned early to read signs: the flight of birds, the crack of thunder, the shape of entrails, less as mystical truths and more as psychological tools. The ability to invoke divine favor in front of crowds would later become one of his most powerful political weapons. He understood something few politicians grasped: belief moves armies more effectively than gold. Even in childhood, those around him spoke in whispers about what he might become. A boy with divine ancestry, a brilliant mind, and an uncle who was Rome's greatest general, he was a living convergence of myth and opportunity. But fate is fickle. Before he even reached adulthood, the Julian name would place him in mortal danger, thrusting him into the center of the bloodiest political struggle Rome had ever witnessed. A childhood in chaos, Sulla, civil war, and exile. Caesar's youth unfolded in a Rome teetering on collapse. The conflict between his uncle Marius and the ruthless general Sulla escalated into a brutal civil war that tore the Republic apart. When Sulla seized control, he initiated a reign of terror through the infamous proscriptions, public death lists on which the names of political enemies were posted for execution. Men disappeared overnight, families were ruined. Bloodshed spilled into the streets as Rome became a hunting ground for revenge, fear, and ruthless ambition. Because Caesar was Marius' nephew, Sulla viewed him not as a child but as a future threat. When Caesar was just a teenager, Sulla demanded that he divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of one of Marius' closest allies. Caesar refused, a shocking act of defiance. Most would have bent the knee to survive. But Caesar chose danger over dishonor. Infuriated, Sulla stripped him of his property, his priesthood, and all legal protections. In effect, Caesar was declared an enemy of the state. The teenager now carried the weight of assassination on his back. Forced into hiding, Caesar fled Rome, moving from one sympathetic household to another along the countryside. Sulla's agents hunted him relentlessly. For the first time in his life, Caesar learned how fragile human power really was, and how quickly fortune could turn. He contracted a deadly illness, nearly died, and survived only through the intervention of allies, who bribed soldiers at checkpoints. At one point, according to later accounts, Caesar changed disguises multiple times to avoid capture. These early experiences carved into him a lesson he would carry throughout his life: never rely on the mercy of powerful men. When Sulla finally relented, supposedly saying, "In that boy are many Mariuses," Caesar returned to Rome. But the scars remained. He had seen firsthand what political violence looked like from the inside. He had felt the cold breath of death at an age when most Roman boys were still training in rhetoric and athletics. This forged in him something invaluable: the ability to face danger without hesitation. Caesar learned that fear was a weapon wielded by the strong and endured by the weak. From then on, he would make sure he was never again the hunted, only the hunter. In many ways, Sulla had unintentionally created his future enemy. By persecuting the young Caesar, he hardened him, sharpened him, and taught him that real power, came not through birthright alone, but through sheer will and unbreakable ambition. Rome had nearly crushed him. Instead, it awakened the Colossus within. From captive to commander, Caesar and the Cilician pirates. Shortly after Sulla's death, Caesar left Rome to build a military career in Asia Minor. But before he could earn glory in battle, he experienced an event so legendary that it reads like mythology. It had truly happened. While traveling near the island of Pharmacusa, Caesar's ship was intercepted by Cilician pirates, the most feared sea raiders of the Mediterranean. They seized him and demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed. He insisted they ask for 50 instead. The pirates didn't know what to make of the arrogant young aristocrat, who acted more like a guest than a prisoner. During his captivity, Caesar displayed a bizarre mixture of charm and authority, recited poetry to the pirates, scolded them when they didn't applaud, exercised with them, and even ordered them to be quiet when he wanted to sleep. At times he warned them casually, almost playfully, that once free, he would return and crucify them all. They laughed with him, thinking he was joking. Wasn't. Caesar's attitude during captivity revealed an extraordinary truth about his character. He had absolute belief in his destiny, even when he was powerless. When his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar immediately raised a small fleet using borrowed ships and local allies. He hunted down the pirates with a speed and precision that stunned the region. Upon capturing them, he carried out his promise. He had them crucified, though, in a gesture of mercy. He ordered their throats cut first to shorten their suffering. This episode marked a crucial turning point. Caesar proved he was not merely a victim of political chaos, but a man capable of imposing his will upon the world, even in lawless waters. This event would echo throughout his life, taught him that boldness unsettles enemies, that confidence inspires followers, and that ruthlessness, applied strategically, could secure his reputation as a man to be feared and respected. By the time he returned to the mainland, whispers already followed him. This young Roman is dangerous. This young Roman is destined. The pirate episode was more than a dramatic story. It was the moment Caesar stopped being shaped by Rome's chaos and began shaping the world around him. A commander was born not through rank or inheritance, but through audacity, vengeance, and unshakable will. Laying the first stones, Caesar's early political climb. Returning to Rome, Caesar entered public life with a fire forged by hardship and survival. He began his ascent in the only way possible for a man with minimal wealth but maximum ambition, mastering the art of persuasion. Caesar became one of the city's most eloquent orators, combining sharp logic with emotional appeal. He accused corrupt governors, defended the oppressed, and won admiration from the people. His speeches were not simply arguments, they were performances, and Rome was captivated. Yet rhetoric alone could not elevate him. He needed allies. Caesar attached himself to the popularis politicians who championed the masses and challenged aristocratic dominance. It was a dangerous alignment, but it fit his vision. He understood that the true power of Rome no longer sat solely in the Senate. It pulsed through the streets, through the forum, through the voices of the poor. Despite lifting them, he lifted himself. This strategy would shape much of his future success and provoke many of his future enemies. To climb the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman political offices, Caesar needed both experience and visibility. He served as military tribune, then questor, then aedile, staging lavish games that drained his finances but won public devotion. Debt piled upon debt, yet Caesar never hesitated. He believed that prestige purchased with risk would return tenfold. Rome loved a showman, and Caesar knew exactly how to write himself into the heart of the city. But beneath the glamour of public festivals and political speeches, he was also mastering the invisible mechanics of power, forming alliances, building networks, forging loyalties. This era of his life was not defined by conquest or bloodshed, but by something far more subtle, the construction of a foundation strong enough to support a future empire. Every choice, every debt, every friendship was a brick in the monument he would one day become. By his early 30s, Caesar had carved himself a place in Rome that few men could achieve in a lifetime. He had survived exile, captivity, poverty, and political hostility. Now the path ahead opened wider. He was ready for real command, ready for war, ready for destiny. The Spanish command, Caesar's first taste of power. Spain Hispania was not a glamorous posting. It was dusty, poor, violent, and filled with tribes who hated Rome just enough to cause trouble, but not enough to threaten independence. For most Roman politicians, being sent to govern Spain was a polite exile, a place to calm down, pay off debts, and maybe steal a little money before returning to Rome. But for Julius Caesar, Spain was something else entirely, a proving ground. When he arrived as propraetor, he carried with him crushing debts, political rivals waiting for failure, and a burning need to prove that he was more than a charismatic Roman aristocrat with a famous family name. In Hispania, for the first time in his life, Caesar commanded an army entirely his own, men who would come to love him, fear him, and follow him with the kind of devotion Rome hadn't seen since the days of Marius. Caesar saw the Spanish tribes not as nuisances, but as opportunities for glory. He launched swift campaigns against rebellious clans, pushing deep into rugged mountain terrain where Roman formations usually struggled. His soldiers noticed something immediately. Caesar did not lead from the back, marched on foot with them, slept on the ground with them, listened to their complaints, and shared their rations. This was not common behavior for Roman aristocrats. Soldiers expected commanders to be distant figures, aloof and above the dirt. Caesar shattered that expectation, and in doing so, built a loyalty that would one day shake the Republic to its core. Victories followed, not epic, history-defining battles, but steady. Grinding successes that showed Rome that Caesar was not merely ambitious, he was effective. During his time in Spain, Caesar experienced a moment that would haunt him forever. Standing before a statue of Alexander the Great, he became overwhelmed by a brutal realization. Alexander had conquered the known world by the time he was 30. Caesar, at nearly the same age, had only minor victories and political deals to his name. He reportedly broke down in tears, not out of self-pity, but out of fury at wasted potential. To Caesar, greatness was not optional. It was fate. It was destiny. And destiny, in his mind, owed him an empire. Spain gave him the clarity he needed. If he wanted to surpass Alexander, he needed power, real power. And to gain that power, Rome must become his battlefield. By the time his governorship ended, Caesar had paid off much of his debt, rewarded his soldiers, and returned to Rome not as a minor noble with big dreams, but as a rising force whose ambitions were beginning to alarm the Senate. His time in Hispania was not the moment that made him immortal, but it was the moment he learned that immortality was within reach. Caesar, unlike most Romans, was willing to grab it, no matter the cost. A debt to destiny. How Crassus financed a future dictator. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, and not just ordinary rich. His wealth was the kind that bent politics, bought armies, and toppled reputations with a whisper. Crassus owned mines, properties, businesses, entire districts of Rome. When fires broke out, and they frequently did, Crassus would buy the burning building at a discount, extinguish the flames with his private fire brigade, then sell the rebuilt property for a profit. It was ruthless, brilliant, and extremely effective. But even the richest man in Rome needed something money couldn't buy: political influence. Know what? And that is where Julius Caesar entered the picture. Caesar was drowning in debt. His political campaigns, lavish games, public feasts, and endless bribery had charmed the Roman masses, but emptied his pockets. Creditors threatened him, senators mocked him, and rivals waited eagerly for him to collapse. But Crassus saw something others didn't. Caesar was a once-in-a-century talent. He possessed charisma, intelligence, and the rare ability to turn failures into stepping stones. Crassus realized that backing Caesar was risky, but if Caesar rose to power, Crassus would own a piece of destiny itself. So Crassus paid off Caesar's impossible debts, funded his political maneuvers, and shielded him from creditors who would have otherwise dragged him into court or into exile. For Caesar, this alliance was not born from affection. Crassus was useful, a means to an end. But he also understood something essential. In Rome, debt was a weapon. To be indebted to Crassus meant safety and, more importantly, mobility. Caesar could now move, campaign, legislate, and climb without constantly looking over his shoulder. And move he did. With Crassus's gold filling his sails, Caesar began positioning himself not as a mere politician, but as a future kingmaker, or perhaps a future king. The Senate watched this partnership with unease. Caesar's charm, mixed with Crassus's wealth, was a potent threat. Together they could sway votes, push legislation, and buy loyalty at levels that alarmed Rome's elite. But the Senate's mistake was assuming Caesar wanted security. He wanted transformation, a reshaping of Roman politics so drastic that future generations would divide history into two eras, before Caesar and after Caesar. And with Crassus beside him, the door to that transformation creaked open. Crassus believed he was using Caesar. Caesar believed he was using Crassus. In truth, they needed each other. Their alliance would shape Rome's next chapter and lead directly to one of the most powerful political unions the world had ever seen. Pompey the Great, Rome's golden hero and Caesar's future rival. If Caesar was ambition incarnate, then Pompey the Great was destiny fulfilled. Long before Caesar became a household name, Pompey had already carved his legend into the bones of the world. He crushed pirates, toppled kings, conquered territories for Rome, and was hailed by the people as a new Alexander the Great. By the time he was 35, he was the most decorated general in Roman history, adored by the public, feared by the Senate, and worshipped by his soldiers. And yet, despite all his triumphs, Pompey lacked one thing Caesar possessed in abundance: the ability to read people, to charm them, to bind them to him through loyalty rather than fear. When Caesar returned from Spain, Pompey was Rome's son, radiant, powerful, and unchallenged. Caesar understood something that others ignored. Men like Pompey eventually fall because they grow too accustomed to victory. Pompey believed Rome adored him. Caesar saw the truth. Rome adored what Pompey represented: strength, stability, and dominance. But Pompey himself? He was admired, yes, but also isolated, elevated so high that he could no longer see the shifting currents beneath him. Pompey and Caesar had a strange relationship. Respect mingled with rivalry, admiration mingled with jealousy. Pompey knew Caesar was dangerous. Not militarily, at least not yet, but politically. Caesar could sway crowds with a speech, win soldiers with kindness, and outmaneuver rivals without them realizing they had been beaten. Pompey, for all his greatness, lacked that political finesse. His power was built on victories. Caesar's power was built on people. As the two men grew closer, first as allies, then as uneasy friends, each believed he understood the other. Pompey saw Caesar as ambitious, but ultimately controllable. Caesar saw Pompey as powerful, but ultimately predictable. Both were wrong. Their friendship would become the fuse that ignited a civil war, one that would shatter the Roman Republic and reshape the world forever. The rise of a political genius, Caesar as consul. By the time Caesar ran for consul, the highest elected office in the Republic, Rome was a storm of bribery, street violence, and political sabotage. Elections were not polite affairs. They were battles fought with coin, muscle, and manipulation. Caesar approached the contest not with fear, but with strategy. He knew he couldn't win by appealing to the elite. Too many senators despised him. But the masses? They loved him. And Caesar understood something fundamental. In Rome, a crowd was more powerful than a Senate hall. When Caesar won the consulship, his enemies expected him to act moderately, to appease the Senate, to play the part of a responsible statesman. Instead, Caesar unleashed a legislative whirlwind, passed land reforms to reward the poor and veterans, bypassed the Senate when they resisted him, and used public assemblies to ram through policies that terrified conservative elites. Pompey and Crassus stood behind him, forming a triumvirate of influence that dominated Rome's political machinery. Caesar didn't just govern, he reshaped the rules of governing. His consulship was not peaceful. The Senate accused him of tyranny. Caesar accused them of corruption. Street gangs loyal to political factions clashed violently, turning Rome into a battleground of ideology and power. Through it all, Caesar remained calm, smiling, measured, as if the chaos around him were not a threat, but a tool. By the end of his term, Caesar had transformed the consulship from an administrative office into a weapon of political revolution. And he wasn't finished. The moment he stepped down, Caesar secured something far more valuable than any political title: a military command that would change the world. The command in Gaul. The First Triumvirate. Three men who ruled the Republic. Rome had no kings. The Republic prided itself on that fact. But for a brief moment in history, Rome was effectively ruled by three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, in a political partnership later called the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office, not written in law, and not sanctioned by tradition. It was an agreement born from ambition, stitched together by mutual benefit, and destined to explode. Each man brought something essential. Crassus brought wealth, oceans of it. Pompey brought military prestige, the love of the army, and the admiration of the people. And Caesar brought political genius, charisma, strategy, and the ability to bind the other two together with persuasion and cunning. Alone, each man was formidable. Together, they were unstoppable. Legislation passed effortlessly. Opponents were crushed or bribed. Rome, for the first time in generations, experienced something close to stable domination, not by the Senate, but by a trio of giants. But the triumvirate was fragile. It was built on ego, ambition, and the assumption that all three men needed each other. The truth was harsh. Only Caesar understood the nature of their alliance. He knew that as long as Pompey and Crassus distrusted each other, they would both rely on him as the balancing force. Caesar positioned himself perfectly, central, indispensable, irreplaceable. While Pompey basked in his fame and Crassus counted his gold, Caesar was planning something far greater. The triumvirate would not last. It couldn't. No world was big enough for three men who wanted to rule it. But for now, their alliance held Rome in its grasp, and Caesar, slowly, quietly, inevitably, began preparing for the chapter that would define his legend, Gaul. Crossing into Gaul, a new world to conquer. When Julius Caesar first marched into Gaul in 58 BCE, he was not entering a distant frontier. He was stepping into an entirely different universe. The landscapes alone felt mythic. Dense, ancient forests where sunlight filtered through in shards of gold. Wide rivers too dangerous for most Roman engineers to tame, and towering hills fortified with wooden ramparts built by tribes who had been at war for longer than Rome had existed. Gaul was not a single people, not a unified nation, but a vast mosaic of fiercely proud tribes who shared language and culture but not loyalty. To Caesar, it was more than territory. It was a stage large enough to showcase his greatness and dangerous enough to destroy him if he miscalculated. Gaul's people were unlike anything Roman aristocrats were prepared for. They were tall, loud, passionate, and terrifying in battle. Their kings commanded loyalty not through laws, but through charisma and sheer physical presence. Their warriors fought with wild courage, painted their bodies, screamed battle chants, and sprinted into combat as if possessed by the gods themselves. To Caesar's polished officers, they seemed barbaric. To Caesar, they were the perfect enemies. Facing such warriors meant that each Roman victory would echo through history. And if he played his cards right, the Senate would have no choice but to acknowledge his brilliance. Rome officially sent Caesar to govern Cisalpine Gaul, the region closest to Italy, but Caesar had no intention of remaining behind a desk. Almost immediately, he sought reasons to intervene deeper into Gaul. Those reasons came quickly. A migrating tribe, the Helvetii, attempted to cross Roman territory, something Caesar framed as a direct threat. Whether the tribe truly intended harm didn't matter. Caesar knew opportunity when it marched toward him. He intercepted them, fought them, defeated them, and then wrote about it with the kind of poetic exaggeration that made even modest victories sound earth-shattering. This campaign became the foundation of his commentaries, Caesar's own written account of the Gallic Wars. In elegant, deceptively simple Latin, he portrayed himself as Rome's protector, the man shielding civilization from the chaos of the north. But beneath that crafted narrative lay a harder truth. Caesar was beginning his march toward absolute power. Every river crossed, every hill taken, every tribe forced to surrender, brought him closer to the destiny he had carved for himself in Spain, the destiny he believed Rome owed him. And so, with legions hardened and loyal, with ambition burning hotter than ever, Caesar crossed fully into Gaul, not as a governor seeking peace, but as a conqueror seeking history. Warriors of the north, understanding the Gallic tribes. To understand Caesar's success in Gaul, one must first understand the people he sought to conquer. The Gauls were not savages, a Roman insult repeated by centuries of historians, but a complex civilization with ironwork. Religion, trade networks extending to Britain and beyond, and a social hierarchy built upon honor and martial prowess. Their priests, the Druids, commanded immense respect. Their craftsmen forged weapons of astonishing beauty. Their traders moved amber, salt, and metal across hundreds of miles. Caesar had not stumbled into a wilderness. He had stepped into a world with its own order, one that viewed Rome not as a civilizer, but as an invader. Their warriors were legendary. Trained from boyhood, they charged into battle with enormous shields, long swords, and terrifying screams meant to shake enemy morale long before the first blow. Many fought nearly naked, not out of barbarism, but out of pride, a declaration that they did not fear wounds. Roman soldiers, disciplined and regimented, found themselves facing an enemy whose courage bordered on madness. Caesar knew that defeating such warriors required more than strength, required psychology. He used Rome's precision to break their momentum, cut through their emotional fury, and turn their passion against them. But the Gauls had something Rome underestimated: loyalty to their chieftains. Tribal bonds were powerful, sometimes more powerful than fear of death. A single charismatic leader could raise tens of thousands of warriors with a few words spoken in a smoky longhouse. Caesar recognized this immediately. He knew he couldn't simply conquer the land. He had to break the alliances that made resistance possible. And so he embarked on a campaign not only of war, but of diplomacy, bribing some tribes, intimidating others, sowing seeds of rivalry wherever he could. Yet despite his efforts, the Gauls were not blind. They saw the pattern. They knew Rome's appetite was to end deep beneath their tribal rivalries. A quiet resentment was growing, resentment that would eventually be molded by one man into a force powerful enough to threaten Caesar's life, his legacy, and the future of Rome itself. Blood and strategy. Caesar's early victories. Caesar's early battles in Gaul were not grand epics like Alesia or Gergovia. They were brutal, swift, and strategic. Caesar understood that the key to conquering Gaul was momentum. He could not give the tribes time to unite, so he struck fast. Against the Helvetii, he used terrain to force them into disadvantage. Against Ariovestus, the Germanic king who had crossed into Gaul, he used psychological warfare, spreading fear among the German ranks, exaggerating Roman strength, and secretly undermining their confidence. What made Caesar exceptional was his ability to turn adversity into leverage. When his own troops mutinied out of fear of the German warriors, Caesar gathered them, delivered a calm, icy speech, and shamed them into obedience. He did not threaten them. He simply told them that he would fight the Germans alone if necessary, and that he believed the legions would rather die than let their commander face danger without them. The mutiny dissolved instantly. Caesar understood men. Victories followed. Towns fell. Tribes surrendered. And each time they did, Caesar added their auxiliaries to his growing army. His forces became a mixture of Romans, Gauls, and allied tribes, a diverse but deadly machine. News of his victories reached Rome, where his political enemies grew uneasy. They had sent Caesar to Gaul, hoping he would fade into irrelevance. Instead, he was becoming a hero. By the end of these early campaigns, Caesar had transformed from a clever politician into a true warlord. His legions trusted him absolutely. His officers admired him. And Gaul, once a vast, independent world, was beginning to buckle under the weight of a man who saw conquest not as violence, but as destiny. The Rhine and the sea, Caesar's unthinkable expeditions. Most Roman generals would have been satisfied with subduing a few hostile tribes. Caesar was not most generals. His ambition stretched farther than Roman maps. When Germanic tribes fled across the Rhine to escape Roman retaliation, Caesar made a decision so audacious it bordered on madness. He ordered the construction of a massive bridge over the Rhine not to occupy German territory but simply to prove that he could. The engineering feat stunned both his own officers and the tribes who watched from the opposite shore. In just 10 days, Roman engineers constructed a bridge strong enough to march legions across a river thought impossible to tame. Caesar marched his men over, burned the villages of enemies who had threatened Rome, and then marched them back, destroying the bridge behind him. It was not conquest, it was a message. Nowhere in Europe was beyond Caesar's reach. But Caesar wasn't done. He then turned his gaze toward an island that had existed in Roman imagination as a place of mist, magic, and monsters: Britain.
Oh.
No Roman army had ever set foot there. Some believed the edge of the world lay in its western cliffs. Caesar saw an opportunity for immortality. Twice he launched expeditions across the Channel, dangerous, unpredictable voyages that tested Roman naval skill to its limits. The first landing was chaotic. Storms scattered his ships. His cavalry was lost at sea. British chariots thundered across the beaches in swirling arcs that stunned Roman legionaries. But Caesar learned quickly. His second expedition was far more calculated, pushing deeper inland and forcing several British tribes to submit. These expeditions did not conquer Britain. That would come almost a century later. But Caesar had accomplished something far more important. He expanded the mental boundaries of Rome. He showed his people that even the edge of the world was within reach if one possessed the will to cross it. More importantly, he fed the legend of Caesar, the man who went where no Roman had gone before. Vercingetorix, the fox who united Gaul. If Caesar was Rome's great conqueror, then Vercingetorix was Gaul's great defender. Young, charismatic, a noble of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix saw what many Gallic chiefs could not. Caesar was not simply punishing rebellious tribes. He was carving an empire. If Gaul did not unite, it would fall tribe by tribe until nothing remained of their heritage. Vercingetorix was the man Gaul needed, a warrior with vision, a leader who understood the Roman mind. He knew Rome's legionary discipline could only be defeated through scorched earth strategy. So he ordered villages to burn their own crops to deprive Caesar's armies of food. He demanded unity, punished dissent, and slowly, painfully, the tribes responded. Tens of thousands rallied behind him, forming the largest Gallic coalition ever assembled. Caesar suddenly found himself facing a foe unlike any he had met in Gaul, a leader whose intelligence matched his own. Vercingetorix avoided open battle, striking supply lines, ambushing scouts, and harassing Roman columns. His strategy was working. Caesar's legions were starving, marching through charred landscapes where even the earth seemed hostile. But Caesar did not crumble. He pushed forward, adapting to every setback, forcing battles where he could, and retreating when necessary. The two men were locked in a contest of endurance, strategy, and political will, one fighting to save a homeland, the other fighting to build an empire. Their clash was leading to a single, inevitable point: a fortress on a hill called Alesia. Alesia, the siege that made a legend. Alesia was more than a battle. It was a miracle of engineering, strategy, and sheer Roman stubbornness. Vercingetorix retreated into the fortified hill town with tens of thousands of warriors, confident he could withstand a siege long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Caesar, massively outnumbered, did something extraordinary. He built a wall around Alesia, and then built another wall facing outward, creating a double ring of fortifications over 10 miles long. It was siege warfare on a scale the world had never seen. Inside Alesia, starvation crept across the population. Outside, a massive Gallic relief army, perhaps 200,000 strong, appeared on the hills. Caesar was trapped between two enemies, outnumbered perhaps 8-1. Any ordinary commander would have fled. Caesar instead doubled down, directing his men like a conductor leading an orchestra of steel and blood. For days, chaos reigned. The outer wall buckled under Gallic assaults. The inner wall trembled as Vercingetorix's forces pushed desperately from within. At the climax of the battle, Caesar himself rode to the weakest point, rallying the legions with a presence so electrifying that even his enemies later spoke of it with awe. The Romans held. The Gallic relief army broke. And Vercingetorix, understanding the fate of Gaul was sealed, surrendered himself in full armor at Caesar's feet, a gesture of tragic dignity. Alesia was the victory that turned Caesar from a powerful Roman into a living legend. It was the peak of his military genius, and the moment Rome realized that Caesar had become too powerful to control. Gaul subdued, the price of a continent. Alesia fallen, resistance collapsed across Gaul. Tribe after tribe submitted, sending hostages, tribute, and warriors to Caesar's growing coalition. But conquest was not as simple as winning battles. The aftermath was harsh, often brutal. Entire regions were devastated by years of scorched earth. Tens of thousands were enslaved. Towns that resisted faced annihilation. Caesar's commentaries gloss over the darker cost of his victories. But archaeology and other Roman sources reveal the truth. The price of Caesar's empire was paid in blood, famine, and cultural erasure. Yet Caesar also built. He constructed roads that stitched Gaul into Rome's economic system. He established towns that would evolve into major European cities. And he brought stability. Roman stability, enforced by the sword. Many Gallic elites, seeing opportunity and cooperation, embraced Roman culture. Within generations, Gaul would become one of the most Romanized regions in the empire. But the personal cost for Caesar was far more complex. His legions were now fiercely loyal to him, and him alone. A political threat the Senate could not ignore. His enemies in Rome began to whisper of tyranny, dictatorship, even monarchy. They feared that Caesar, fresh from conquering an entire continent, would march on Rome next, and in time he would. Gaul was subdued. But the real war, the war for control of Rome, was about to begin. Caesar versus Pompey, a friendship destined for war. Pompey the Great had once been the golden hero of Rome, a man whose shadow stretched across continents, whose victories filled temples, and whose triumphal parades clogged the streets for days. Caesar, by contrast, had been the rising star, the ambitious but unproven aristocrat fighting his way into greatness. For a brief moment in history, the two men were bound not by rivalry, but by marriage, alliances, and political survival. Yet under the surface, their partnership was a powder keg. Pompey wanted stability. Caesar wanted ascension. And Rome was too small for two men who believed destiny favored them. As Caesar's conquests in Gaul expanded his power, his armies, and his legendary status, Pompey watched with growing unease. The Senate, terrified of a general who had effectively created a nation-sized war machine, began courting Pompey, whispering that he alone could protect the Republic. Pompey, who once had no love for the old aristocrats, found himself drifting toward them, seduced by flattery and the illusion that the Republic depended on him. Caesar sensed the shift like a wolf sensing the change in the wind. Letters from Rome warned him that Pompey was no longer speaking of him as a partner but as a threat. His enemies demanded he disband his legions and return home as a private citizen, vulnerable, isolated, and likely doomed in a courtroom controlled by his rivals. The political battle lines were being drawn, and both men knew it. Pompey believed Caesar would submit. After all, Pompey had controlled more armies, won more wars, and held more honor. But he underestimated how deeply Caesar feared irrelevance, and how much he believed the future belonged to him. Caesar believed that fate was a living force, choosing champions, and he had felt its pull since youth. And so, as Pompey consolidated power in Rome, Caesar prepared for a confrontation neither man wanted, but both knew was unavoidable. Their alliance, forged by ambition, was ending exactly the same way it began, with ambition. And Rome, caught between two titans, braced for a storm it could not possibly contain. Crossing the Rubicon, the point of no return. The Rubicon was a narrow river, shallow enough to wade through, but in Roman law, it was a boundary that no general could cross while commanding troops. To cross it was treason, the act of a man declaring war on the Republic itself. As Caesar stood on its bank in early 49 BC, he gazed into the dark water, knowing that one step forward would change the world forever. Behind him stood the 13th Legion, veterans who had followed him through forests, mountains, and frozen winds. They did not ask if the march was legal. They asked only if Caesar believed it was right. For Caesar, the choice was not between war and peace, but between survival and annihilation. Rome had left him no path home that didn't end in chains or a dagger in his back. Yet even in that tension, he hesitated. The river seemed almost alive, whispering the weight of history. Then, in a moment that would echo through millennia, Caesar spoke the fateful words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. He spurred his horse forward, and the legion followed. The Rubicon broke beneath their boots like the snapping of an ancient seal. At that moment, the Republic's fragile balance shattered. Rome had entered a civil war, not between armies, but between ideologies. Between the old aristocracy and a new world trying to be born. When word reached Rome, senators panicked. Pompey, stunned by Caesar's audacity, ordered the city evacuated. Rome, the beating heart of an empire, fell into chaos. Families fled, treasuries were drained. The Senate abandoned its marble halls, retreating into the shadows of Greece. Caesar, meanwhile, did something unthinkable. He walked into the empty city, not as a conqueror, but as a man entering a tomb. He found Pompey gone, his rivals scattered, and the Senate's authority collapsed. The war had begun, not with a clash of swords, but with silence, the silence of a republic running from its darkest fear. The flight of Pompey, Rome's hero on the run. Pompey had never believed Caesar would dare cross the Rubicon. But now, with Caesar marching south at terrifying speed, Pompey found himself making decisions he never imagined, though he had once commanded legions across continents. The forces in Italy were raw recruits, no match for Caesar's hardened veterans. Rather than risk a decisive battle, Pompey made a strategic retreat, moving his forces to Brundisium and then crossing into Epirus. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life. Rome, the city he had defended and served for decades, had turned its streets over to his rival without a fight. His supporters interpreted his departure as cowardice. But Pompey knew that if Caesar defeated him in Italy, the war would be over in a single stroke. Across the Mediterranean, Pompey worked tirelessly to rebuild his power. He summoned allies from the eastern provinces, called upon kings who owed him their thrones, and gathered a vast army. Soon, he commanded more soldiers than Caesar, an enormous force of infantry, cavalry, archers, and naval power. Pompey still believed the Republic could be saved, and that he remained its only defender. But something had changed. Pompey had been a legend once, Rome's youthful conqueror, the darling of the Senate. Now he felt the weight of age, the erosion of confidence, the fear that he was fighting, not only Caesar, but time itself. Caesar was bold, charismatic, and beloved by his troops. Pompey, once known for lightning-fast victories, had become cautious, too cautious. Even as he rebuilt his army, he was haunted by a simple truth. He was no longer the unstoppable general he had been in his youth. Caesar had become the man Pompey once was, and that made him dangerous beyond anything Pompey had ever faced. The day Caesar destroyed a Republic hero. The plains of Pharsalus in 48 BC were bathed in a pale morning light when two of the greatest armies in ancient history assembled. Pompey commanded nearly double Caesar's infantry, a cavalry force that outnumbered Caesar's 10-1, and the backing of the Senate's wealth and nobility. Caesar's men were exhausted, outnumbered, and on unfamiliar ground. Yet Caesar walked the lines with calm certainty, calling his soldiers comrades instead of men, a sign of equality that electrified them. Pompey's strategy was simple: overwhelm Caesar's exposed flank with cavalry, break the line, and smash the enemy center. It was a tactic that should have worked, but Caesar had read Pompey perfectly. He secretly placed a hidden fourth line of infantry behind his cavalry screen, ordering them to wait until Pompey committed his horsemen. When the battle began, Pompey's cavalry charged with thunderous force and crashed straight into Caesar's trap. As Pompey's horsemen faltered under the sudden counterattack, Caesar ordered a full advance. His troops surged forward with disciplined fury. The center buckled, the right collapsed, and soon Pompey's mighty army dissolved into chaos. Soldiers who had marched with the confidence of noble birth now fled in terror, while Caesar's veterans, hardened by a decade in Gaul, carved through them like a tidal wave. Pompey watched the destruction of everything he had built. His confidence shattered as the battlefield turned into a nightmare of dust, blood, and screaming. The Senate's dreams of restoring the old order burned away. Caesar had not just won a battle, he had broken the Republic's last great champion. As night fell, Caesar walked the field in silence, mourning the Romans who had died fighting Romans. Across the countryside, Pompey fled once more, his once mighty name reduced to a whisper in the wind. The war was not yet over, but the Republic had lost its greatest defender. The death of Pompey, tragedy on an Egyptian shore. Pompey fled to Egypt, believing the young king Ptolemy the 13th owed him support. After all, Pompey himself had once restored Ptolemy's father to the throne. But Egypt was a nest of political intrigue, and Ptolemy's advisors feared that helping Pompey would anger Caesar, who was now the most powerful man in the world. As Pompey's small ship approached the Egyptian coast near Pelusium, he saw a tiny skiff rowing out to meet him. It held a handful of soldiers, too few for honor, too many for comfort. Yet Pompey, worn down by defeat and humiliation, convinced himself they meant safety. He stepped into the boat with dignity, clutching a worn scroll containing his achievements. The men did not speak Latin. They avoided his eyes. When the skiff reached shallow water, the soldiers stood up. Pompey rose as well, perhaps to greet them, or perhaps sensing, too late, the truth. One man drove a dagger into his back. Pompey, Rome's greatest hero, fell silently into the surf. His severed head was later presented to Caesar as a twisted gift, but when Caesar saw it, he wept. Even though Pompey had been his rival, he was once his friend, his ally, even his family through marriage. Caesar had wanted a final confrontation, not a cheap assassination carried out by opportunistic courtiers. Pompey deserved a soldier's death, not this. On a lonely foreign shore, the last great defender of the Republic died, not in battle, but in betrayal. And with him, something inside Caesar died too. Because Pompey had been the last man alive who truly understood him. Cleopatra, the queen who changed Rome. Cleopatra VII was no ordinary monarch. At just 21, she was already a veteran of palace intrigues, civil wars, and diplomatic crises. Her intellect was legendary. She spoke multiple languages, mastered philosophy and astronomy, and understood the fragile balance of power that kept Egypt alive. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, she saw something no one else dared to see, not the conqueror of Rome, but a man at a crossroads. He had won a civil war, but victory had left him adrift, cut off from familiar alliances, and still hunted by rivals across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra offered him something Rome never had: stability, wealth, and a throne untouched by the Senate's claws. Their first meeting would become the stuff of legends. Smuggled into the palace, wrapped in a carpet or bedding sack, depending on which ancient gossip one believes. Cleopatra emerged before Caesar, not as a supplicant, but as a queen, claiming her right. Caesar, nearly 30 years her senior, was disarmed by her boldness. He had met countless monarchs, but none who commanded a room with such effortless charisma. In her presence, he saw not just a ruler, but a partner with whom he could reshape the world. Together, they formed a political alliance disguised as a romance, or perhaps a romance disguised as a political alliance. Cleopatra needed Caesar to secure her throne against her brother's supporters. Caesar needed Cleopatra's navy, grain, and wealth to rebuild Rome and crush his remaining enemies. Their union created shockwaves not just in Egypt, but across the entire Mediterranean. Cleopatra was not merely a lover. She was the only sovereign capable of meeting Caesar as an equal. But their relationship did more than shape politics. It reshaped public opinion. In Rome, whispers spread like wildfire. The great Caesar had been seduced by an Eastern queen, that she enchanted him with mysticism, luxury, and exotic decadence, that he had abandoned Roman virtues for the silk-draped halls of Alexandria. None of this was true, but perception mattered. Cleopatra's presence became the first major crack in Caesar's image back home. Yet in the months that followed, as they planned campaigns and charted the future, one truth became undeniable. Cleopatra had elevated herself into Caesar's world, and Caesar had stepped into hers. Their bond, however scandalous to Rome, would shape the destiny of both a republic and a kingdom. The Nile campaign, Caesar at war in Egypt. The Alexandrian War was one of the most dangerous campaigns Caesar ever fought, yet history often reduces it to a footnote. In reality, it was a desperate struggle, fought in a labyrinth of narrow streets, shifting alliances, and political treachery. Caesar found himself cornered with a small force, trapped between the hostile Egyptian army and the unpredictable tides of the city's politics. For the first time in years, the conqueror of Gaul was fighting not for glory, but for survival. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors believed they could overthrow Caesar by sheer force. They underestimated him. Caesar transformed Alexandria into a battlefield, seizing the palace quarter and constructing makeshift defenses. The fighting was brutal close combat around libraries, temples, and harbors, where fire and collapsing buildings added to the horror. At one point, Caesar was forced to dive into the harbor and swim to safety under a hail of arrows, famously holding important documents above the water with one hand. Cleopatra remained a political anchor throughout the conflict. While Caesar fought in the streets, she worked tirelessly to secure allies, negotiate with factions, and maintain the loyalty of the Egyptian populace. She understood her land better than he ever could, and many of Caesar's decisions were guided by her knowledge of Egypt's political landscape. Their partnership deepened, and not merely romantically, but strategically. The turning point came with the arrival of reinforcements from Rome. Caesar launched a final offensive. Defeating Ptolemy's forces in a decisive battle near the Nile Delta, Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing, ending the civil war and securing Cleopatra's throne. For Caesar, the victory meant safety and renewed authority. For Cleopatra, it meant absolute power, now shared with the most influential man in the world. After the war, Caesar remained in Egypt longer than anyone expected. Some claim he stayed for love. Others say he simply needed rest after a decade of non-stop campaigns. But in those months, he and Cleopatra forged a political vision that frightened the Roman elite. A future where Caesar ruled not just Rome, but an empire of East and West, perhaps even as a king. The return to Rome, a dictator's welcome. When Caesar finally returned to Rome in 46 BC, he arrived not as a general seeking approval, but as a man who had reshaped the Mediterranean. The city erupted in celebration for triumphs in 1 month, each commemorating a different conquest: Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa. The parades were extravagant, even by Roman standards. Prisoners marched in chains, exotic animals were displayed, and entire floats reenacted his victories. But beneath the pageantry lurked a dangerous truth. Caesar was no longer merely powerful, he was untouchable. Rome had changed in his absence. The Senate was fractured, many nobles were dead or in exile, and the people looked to Caesar for stability. He used this moment not to rest, but to assert dominance. He passed sweeping reforms, redistributed land, and forgave many former enemies, moves that won him support among both the masses and moderates. Yet every act of generosity also increased the fear that he was dismantling the Republic piece by piece. One of the most controversial moments was his affair with Cleopatra, which he refused to hide. When Cleopatra visited Rome with their son Caesarion, scandal erupted. Statues of her were placed in Caesar's villa, and rumors spread that he intended to make her queen of Rome. Senators were horrified not only because Caesar had a foreign lover, but because Cleopatra's presence hinted at monarchy, a concept Romans despised. Still, Caesar pushed forward. He redesigned the calendar, eliminated corruption in the courts, and launched massive construction projects. Rome became a city reborn under his leadership. To the people, Caesar was a savior. To the Senate, he was becoming a threat far greater than Pompey had ever been. As he sat in the Curia wearing the purple cloak of a triumphator, the color of King Xan's uncomfortable question echoed through the Republic. If Caesar already had the power of a king, how long until he claimed the title? The Eastern Wars, Caesar versus Pharnaces Veni Vidi, Vici. Barely finished celebrating his triumphs, Caesar was forced back into war. Pharnaces II of Pontus, son of Mithridates the Great, had taken advantage of Rome's civil conflict to reclaim lands once lost to Pompey. His campaign was swift and brutal. Towns that resisted were destroyed. Roman allies were slaughtered. Caesar, despite exhaustion, could not allow such rebellion to stand. He marched east with astonishing speed, traveling across mountains and foreign territories with the precision of a man who knew every hour counted. Pharnaces believed Caesar was spread too thin, still recovering from previous wars. He assumed Caesar would negotiate or delay. He assumed wrong. Caesar attacked immediately at the Battle of Zela. The clash was fierce but brief. Caesar's troops overwhelmed Pharnaces in a matter of hours. Ancient historians say the battle was so swift that the dust had hardly settled before Caesar declared victory. When reporting success to Rome, he sent the now immortal message, Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. The phrase was not arrogant, it was truth. Caesar had resolved a major conflict faster than most generals could organize a march. But the victory also revealed something more ominous. Caesar's military genius was reaching its absolute peak. His enemies were learning that resisting him was futile. He was a storm that left no time for preparation. Despite the speed of the campaign, Caesar did not lose sight of diplomacy. He reorganized the eastern kingdoms, installed loyal rulers, and ensured the trade routes remained stable. His actions showed a vision beyond conquest. It wasn't merely defeating enemies, he was shaping an empire. But even as he secured Rome's eastern flank, another storm brewed in the west. In Spain, Pompey's sons had raised a massive army. The final embers of resistance were gathering force, and Caesar knew he would soon face the last chapter of the civil war. Spain again, the battle against Pompey's sons. The final major threat to Caesar's dominance came not from foreign kings, but from the blood of his greatest rival. Ides and Sextus Pompey, sons of Pompey the Great, had raised armies in Hispania. They commanded legions fiercely loyal to the memory of their father, and they positioned themselves as the last defenders of the Republic. Their propaganda painted Caesar as a tyrant, a man who sought to erase the legacy of Rome and replace it with monarchy. Caesar marched to Spain with grim determination. He knew this campaign would be different. Pompey's sons were younger, hungrier, and more desperate than their father had ever been. Their soldiers fought with the fury of men avenging a fallen hero. The terrain was harsh, and Caesar's forces struggled to adapt to guerrilla-like tactics designed to harass and bleed his army dry. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Munda in 45 BC. It was one of Caesar's hardest battles, so fierce that Caesar himself had to charge into the front lines to prevent collapse. He later admitted it was the only time he truly feared defeat. The fighting raged across hills and uneven ground, with Pompeian forces refusing to break even under overwhelming pressure. In the end, Caesar prevailed. Yes, Pompey was killed during the retreat. Sextus Pompey escaped, later becoming a powerful pirate king, but he no longer posed an immediate threat. The victory at Munda ended the Roman civil wars. No rival army remained. No Senate faction could stand against him. Caesar returned to Rome not merely as a conqueror, but as the undisputed master of the known world. Yet victory carried a strange emptiness. With all enemies defeated, what remained for Caesar? A man who had spent decades climbing, battling, and defying fate suddenly found himself standing alone at the summit, surrounded not by equals, by fearful senators and adoring crowds who no longer knew how to speak to him as a man. Yet in that silence, a deadly conspiracy began to form. A new Rome, reforms that transformed an empire. Back in Rome, Caesar launched the most ambitious reform program in the city's history. He sought not merely to fix problems, but to redesign the Republic from its foundations. Decades of civil wars had shattered institutions, corrupted elections, and deepened inequality, Caesar believed. Rome needed not patchwork solutions, but a complete overhaul, and he saw himself as the only man capable of delivering it. He restructured the Senate, filling its seats with men from across Italy and the provinces. This inclusion angered traditionalists, who believed Caesar was diluting the aristocracy with outsiders. But to Caesar, Rome was no longer a city, it was a world, and a world demanded broader representation. He reformed the grain system, stabilized coinage, and improved the justice courts. He established colonies for veterans, reducing poverty while spreading Roman culture. He initiated massive construction projects, including the Forum Iulium, and began plans for the largest library the world had ever seen. Even the calendar received a transformation. The Julian calendar, still the basis of modern timekeeping, replaced centuries of chaotic lunar calculations. Yet the more Caesar built, the more his enemies panicked. Every reform strengthened his authority. Every success made Rome less dependent on the Senate. Traditionalists whispered that Caesar behaved like a king in all but name. His refusal to disband his personal guard and his increasing acceptance of godlike honors. Statues, holidays, priesthoods fueled rumors that he intended to crown himself. But Caesar saw himself differently, believed he was saving the Republic from collapse, protecting it from its own dysfunction. His power to him was a tool, not a throne. The Senate, however, no longer cared about his intentions. They saw only the rise of a man too powerful to control. And in their fear, they convinced themselves that the only solution was to kill him. The crown and the crowd, did Caesar want to be king? Caesar's return to Rome as dictator for life was a moment the Republic had never been built to withstand. Rome had always defined itself in opposition to monarchy. The very birth of the Republic came from a king being dragged from his throne and expelled. Yet now, Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and victor of civil wars, stood at the apex of all Roman power. He wore triumphal robes, received sacred honors, and accepted the title Pater Patria. For some, these gestures were symbolic. For others, they were omens, warning signs that Caesar sought something forbidden, a crown. But Caesar's intentions remained frustratingly elusive. He was a man who understood political theater better than any of his contemporaries, and he wielded public opinion as surely as he wielded a sword. Each gesture he made could be interpreted as both ambition and humility, and that ambiguity kept Rome in a constant state of nervous fascination. The Senate watched him closely. Some senators whispered that he enjoyed divine honors too much, that he allowed statues of himself among the gods, that he permitted his face to appear on coins, something no Roman had dared to do since kingship was abolished. Others insisted that he refused a diadem every time it was offered, that he corrected flatterers, and that he upheld every tradition that did not interfere with the stability of the state. But the crowd loved him. When he appeared at the Lupercalia festival, and Antony attempted the now infamous act, offering Caesar a crown, the people gasped. Was this the moment Rome would fall back into monarchy? Caesar refused the crown, but the act itself suggested that he wanted the world to see the rejection. It painted him as a savior of republican virtue while simultaneously planting the idea that he was the only man worthy of kingship. The Lupercalia was not the only moment that stoked fears. Caesar's behavior in Senate sessions became increasingly autocratic. He sat while others stood. He spoke last on every issue, and the senators had to rise in his presence. Some interpreted this as necessary authority. Others saw it as a slow suffocation of their own dignity. His reforms, though beneficial, were sweeping and unilateral. He rewrote the calendar, replaced magistrates, expanded the Senate with his own loyalists, and planned vast campaigns into Parthia. To his supporters, this was visionary leadership. To his enemies, it looked like the blueprint of a king. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said that Caesar planned to move the capital to Alexandria. Others said he was preparing to be crowned in the east. The truth was likely far more nuanced. Caesar certainly believed the Republic was broken, paralyzed by greed, corruption, and endless civil conflict. He believed only one man could stabilize it, and that man was himself. But even if Caesar did not desire the title king, he undeniably behaved like one, the center of Rome's political orbit, the figure around whom all power revolved. And in a republic allergic to monarchy, that alone was enough to spark a mortal conspiracy. The Senate conspiracy, daggers in the shadows. Conspiracies in Rome often began as whispers, cautious, floating, deniable. But the conspiracy against Julius Caesar ignited like dry brush under a rising sun. The Senate had long been divided between supporters, opportunists, and old-guard aristocrats who believed Caesar had shattered the Republic. Men such as Cassius, a veteran of war and a master of cunning, believed deeply that Caesar's power threatened the liberty of all Romans. Others, like Brutus, were driven by a complicated sense of duty, philosophy, and personal conflict. As Caesar elevated himself above the old norms, the faction that viewed him as a tyrant found unity in a shared fear that Caesar, with his armies, his popularity, and his reforms, would become a king in all but name. The conspiracy began with a small circle but expanded with shocking speed. Dozens of senators, some noble, some petty, some resentful, joined with varying motives. What bound them together was a shared belief that Caesar would never relinquish power. Some conspirators were driven by personal humiliation, some by jealousy of Caesar's achievements, others by a genuine fear that the Republic would die under a single ruler. What made the conspiracy deadly was that it mixed idealism with ambition, fear with calculation, patriotism with ego. These men gathered in secret, often at night, in dimly lit homes, far from the prying eyes of Caesar's informants. Brutus was always the key prize. Caesar trusted him, loved him even. Bringing Brutus into the conspiracy gave the plot a sense of philosophical legitimacy. Brutus adhered to Stoic ideals, sacrifice, duty, the good of the state, and believed that tyranny must be resisted at any cost. Cassius skillfully manipulated this sense of honor, presenting the act of killing Caesar as the noble restoration of Roman freedom. Their meetings grew more frequent, the plans more detailed. They chose the Ides of March, a Senate meeting where Caesar would appear without armed guards, as the perfect moment to strike. Caesar's trust in his colleagues became the very mechanism of his death. Still, many conspirators wavered. They feared Caesar's popularity, feared that the people might rise in anger, feared the wrath of Caesar's loyal generals. Some proposed killing Antony as well, others argued that one death was enough. They debated, they hesitated, they dreamed of Rome reborn. And all the while, the shadow of their plan grew darker. They convinced themselves that history would praise them, that statues would be built in their honor, that the Republic would bloom once more. They never imagined the chaos that would follow, or how deeply they misunderstood both Caesar and the people he ruled. Ides of March, the assassination of Julius Caesar. The morning of March 15th dawned with a strange stillness. Caesar awoke restless. Ancient writers say his wife Calpurnia begged him not to go to the Senate that day, troubled by nightmares of his statue bleeding and the city crying out. Omens abounded. A sacrificed animal was found without a heart. A man warned Caesar in the street to beware the Ides of March, and even the weather seemed unsettled. Caesar hesitated, but business called, and his pride would not allow him to appear timid. The conspirators waited at the Senate, intent, anxious, hiding their blades beneath their togas. Every moment Caesar delayed tightened the coil of tension around them. When Caesar finally arrived, the senators gathered around in a circle, too close, too eager. It was a scene choreographed to appear respectful, but meant to trap him. One conspirator approached with a petition, another with a request, another with a distraction. In an instant, the trap closed. The first dagger struck, a glancing blow, and Caesar, stunned, cried out. Then, as if a dam burst, the other conspirators lunged. Over 20 men stabbed him, their blows frantic, chaotic, fueled by panic and adrenaline. Caesar fought back at first, but when he saw Brutus among them, the man he trusted, the man he believed loyal, something within him broke. The ancient accounts say he covered his face with his toga, resigning himself to death. He collapsed beneath the statue of Pompey, his former rival, in a tragic twist of fate. The conspirators, breathless and spattered with blood, stood over him, believing they had saved Rome. But what they had actually done was unleash a storm. Caesar's body lay lifeless on the Senate floor, his blood pooling around the marble, while outside the city waited in ignorance of the earthquake that had just been triggered. Inside the chamber, silence fell. Not triumph, not celebration, but the heavy, suffocating realization that there was no turning back from what they had done. Aftermath. Chaos in the streets of Rome. Rome did not react as the conspirators expected. They had imagined crowds cheering, the Senate restored, and the Republic embracing its liberators. Instead, fear seized the city. At first, confused rumors spread. Caesar was wounded. Caesar was dead. Caesar was alive, but attacked. People ran through the streets, unsure of who controlled the government or whether violence would spill over. Shops closed, markets emptied, families barricaded their homes. The conspirators, who had hoped to parade through the Forum as heroes, found themselves isolated and uncertain. The Senate dissolved into panic. Some fled the city. Others aligned themselves cautiously with the conspirators. Antony, who narrowly escaped being murdered alongside Caesar, recognized the danger immediately. He took control of the situation with remarkable speed, securing Caesar's papers, treasury, and supporters. The conspirators attempted to frame the murder as an act of liberation, but the public mood shifted rapidly toward grief and anger. Caesar had been loved, not by the elite but by the masses, by soldiers, by veterans, by settlers in his newly founded colonies. To them, Caesar was the man who gave them land, food, dignity, and hope. The conspirators' fatal miscalculation was that they killed Caesar the man, but they strengthened Caesar the symbol. His death did not restore the Republic, it shattered it. In the coming days, alliances shifted, factions mobilized, and the political vacuum he left behind widened into a void that demanded a new ruler. And as history would show, that void would not be filled by Brutus, Cassius, or any senator. It would be filled by a young man making his quiet journey toward Rome, a young man carrying Caesar's name. Antony's funeral speech, turning grief into fire. Caesar's funeral became one of the most transformative moments in Roman history, a political masterstroke, theatrical spectacle, and a catalyzing explosion of public emotion. Mark Antony, now the most powerful man in Rome, understood better than anyone the power of narrative. He seized control of the funeral, pushing aside the conspirators' attempts to portray Caesar as a tyrant. Instead, Antony painted him as a beloved father of the people, a warrior whose victories filled Rome's coffers, a ruler whose generosity touched every household. The speech, immortalized by Shakespeare centuries later, was a calculated masterpiece. Antony lifted Caesar's blood-soaked cloak before the crowd, pointing out each stab wound, naming each conspirator responsible. He broke the crowd's composure. He turned grief into rage. When Antony read Caesar's will, revealing money left to every Roman citizen, the effect was electric. The crowd erupted in fury. They demanded justice. They demanded vengeance. They surged through the streets, attacking the conspirators' homes, torching buildings, and hunting anyone associated with the assassination. Antony transformed a funeral into a revolution. The conspirators fled for their lives. Their vision of restoring the Republic collapsed utterly. Antony, once overshadowed by Caesar, now stepped into the role of avenger and protector. But unknown to him, a new force, younger, quieter, more patient, was entering the arena. And soon Antony would discover that Caesar's true legacy was not his death, but the heir he left behind. The rise of Octavian, Caesar's heir, steps forward. Caesar's will contained a revelation that shocked Rome. He had adopted his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his son and heir. Octavian was only 18, a frail, studious young man with no military career and no political office, yet he possessed something more valuable than armies or age: Caesar's name. When Octavian arrived in Italy, many underestimated him. Antony dismissed him as a child. The Senate saw him as a pawn. The conspirators hoped he would fade quietly into obscurity. But Octavian had inherited Caesar's determination, cunning, and understanding of power. He began by securing loyalty. He paid Caesar's promised bequests to the people out of his own limited funds, winning instant public favor. He approached Caesar's veterans, not with commands, but with respect, reminding them of their loyalty to his father. Slowly but strategically, he built a power base. Rome began to whisper, "The young Caesar is rising." Antony grew uneasy. The Senate grew hopeful, believing they could control him, but Octavian revealed himself as a political prodigy, outmaneuvered both Antony and the Senate, positioning himself as the true champion of Caesar's legacy. Within a year, Octavian forced the Senate to recognize him, marched alongside Caesar's loyal legions, and compelled Antony to negotiate rather than crush him. By the time the conspirators regrouped in the east, Octavian had become something no one expected: a rival to Antony, a power in his own right. In the future of Rome, he would not stop until every man who murdered Caesar was hunted down. And long after that, he would not stop until Rome itself bowed before him. The War of Revenge. Antony and Octavian versus the conspirators. The death of Julius Caesar did not bring peace. It ignited a wildfire of retribution that swept across the Roman world. After Antony's masterful political maneuvering in Rome, conspirators fled eastward, gathering allies and raising legions in anticipation of the inevitable reckoning. But the most unexpected force emerged not from veteran generals, but from the quiet, calculating ambition of a young man barely out of adolescence: Octavian. Though Antony initially dismissed him as a child wearing Caesar's name like an oversized cloak, Octavian proved remarkably adept at exploiting the chaotic political climate. He rallied Caesar's veterans with promises of loyalty and vengeance, using Caesar's memory as a weapon more powerful than any sword. The Senate foolishly believed they could use Octavian as a pawn against Antony, but they underestimated the young heir's strategic brilliance. In a stunning reversal, Octavian marched on Rome not as a supplicant, but as a force demanding recognition. By the time both sides realized they had been cornered into cooperation, Octavian had maneuvered himself onto equal footing with Antony. Together with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship with sweeping powers. Their first order of business was not reform, not stability, but a long, bloody list of enemies, rivals, and targets. The proscriptions began, covering Rome in fear, as hundreds were executed or exiled in the name of securing Caesar's legacy. With Rome pacified through terror, the new triumvirs turned their attention eastward. Brutus and Cassius had amassed armies, money, and influence, perhaps more than even Caesar had possessed at the start of his civil war. The clash at Philippi was not merely a military confrontation. It was a cosmic settling of accounts. Antony emerged as a fiery, charismatic commander, charging into battle with the intensity of a man possessed. Octavian, though less experienced, proved steady and determined, often pushing himself to the point of collapse to maintain the appearance of an equal partner. Their dual assaults shattered the conspirators' forces. Cassius, believing all was lost, took his own life. Weeks later, Brutus, facing encirclement and defeat, chose the same fate. The death of Brutus symbolized the end of the Republic's final breath of resistance. Caesar's murderers fell not to a chaotic backlash, but to an organized, calculated campaign of vengeance, led by the man they had underestimated most. In the aftermath of Philippi, the Roman world was effectively divided between Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. Their alliance was already strained, their ambitions incompatible. Eventually, the war of revenge would evolve into a war for domination, a war that would reshape the fate of Rome and complete the transformation. Caesar himself had begun. Caesar the god. Apotheosis and immortality. After the smoke of civil war settled, Julius Caesar transcended mere politics. Rome, a city built on tradition and ancestral worship, had never deified a mortal leader before. But Caesar's supporters, especially Octavian, understood the power of symbolism. They knew that Caesar's death had elevated him into something greater than a general, greater than a dictator, even greater than a man. When a comet streaked across the sky during the games held in Caesar's honor, the public immediately interpreted it as a sign of divine approval, the soul of Caesar ascending to the heavens. Octavian seized the moment, proclaiming the comet Caesar's star, a celestial confirmation that his adoptive father had been welcomed among the gods. This moment was transformative. Caesar became Divus Julius, the divine Julius, the first Roman to be officially deified. Temples were built in his honor, priests were appointed to serve him, and a statue depicted him with a star on his head. The Senate, once fearful of Caesar's power, now found itself endorsing his immortality. Deification served multiple purposes. It honored Caesar, it soothed the grief of the people, and most importantly, it provided Octavian with a foundation of legitimacy unparalleled in Roman history. As the son of a god, Octavian could claim a sacred aura, one that Antony, despite all his charisma and military prowess, could never fully match. The transformation of Caesar into a deity was not simply a political maneuver. It reflected the profound emotional bond he had cultivated with the masses. Caesar had fed them during famine, given them land, and filled their days with grand spectacles and festivals. His charisma was magnetic, his generosity legendary, and his death brutal and public turned him into a martyr. The people who had once feared his ascent now worshipped him. His divine status allowed his memory to seep into every corner of Roman life. Coins bore his image with the inscription "God made manifest." His temple became a central hub of Roman identity. Caesar's presence was everywhere, shaping Rome's spiritual landscape, even in death. But perhaps the most significant impact of Caesar's new godhood was its role in reshaping Roman governance. As Caesar ascended to the divine, the line between mortal authority and sacred power blurred. Octavian harnessed this shift to legitimize his eventual transformation into Augustus, founder of the Roman Empire. By becoming the son of a god, Octavian ensured that the spirit of Caesar, the reformer, the conqueror, the visionary, would continue to shape the destiny of Rome for centuries. Through divinity, Caesar achieved what no mortal conqueror ever could, a legacy immune to time. Caesar the general, military genius or opportunist? Julius Caesar's military achievements remain among the most debated in history. Was he a genius of strategy and logistics, or simply an ambitious opportunist who exploited Rome's weakened frontiers? His campaigns in Gaul showcased his brilliance. Facing tribes that fought with fierce independence, Caesar used flexibility, mobility, and psychological warfare to devastating effect. He built bridges across impossible rivers, launched surprise winter offensives, and manipulated intertribal rivalries to divide and conquer. His commentaries, though self-serving, reveal a commander who understood not just tactics, but human nature, the fears, ambitions, and pride that shaped his enemies' decisions. Caesar's greatest triumphs often came not from overwhelming strength, but from audacity. His invasion of Britain was unprecedented. His crossing of the Rhine was a feat of engineering that stunned Europe. His siege of Alesia remains one of the most astonishing operations in ancient warfare, encircling an entire city while simultaneously defending against a massive relief army. His men did not follow him out of fear, but out of loyalty bordering on devotion. They believed in Caesar because he shared their hardships, marched at their pace, fought beside them, and rewarded them generously. To a Roman soldier, Caesar was not a distant patrician, but a commander who lived among them like a brother. Yet critics argue that Caesar's military brilliance was inseparable from his political ambitions. His campaigns in Gaul were not sanctioned by the Senate as a crusade for Rome's glory. They were a vehicle for personal power. His victories brought him enormous wealth, unrivaled popularity, and a hardened army loyal to him alone. Some argue that Caesar's actions destabilized the Republic. Without his conquests, perhaps civil war would have been avoided. But even this criticism points to a deeper truth. Caesar understood that in Rome's decaying political environment, military success was the ultimate currency. In the end, whether one views Caesar as a genius or an opportunist depends on how one interprets power. His victories undeniably expanded Rome's territory and influence. His strategies inspired generations of generals, from Trajan to Napoleon, and his leadership redefined what it meant to command. Caesar may have fought for glory, but his legacy as a general endures because he delivered results unmatched in Roman history, results that elevated him from mortal commander to eternal symbol of military excellence, the mind behind the power. Julius Caesar's political genius often receives less attention than his military conquests. But in truth, it was his mastery of politics that enabled every other aspect of his rise. Caesar possessed an uncanny ability to read people, their desires, fears, and ambitions, and to position himself as the man who could fulfill them. His early political career was marked by strategic alliances with Rome's most powerful figures, including Crassus, whose wealth funded Caesar's ambitions, and Pompey, whose military prestige bolstered Caesar's credibility. The Triumvirate was not merely a pact, it was a testament to Caesar's understanding that collaboration, even with rivals, could serve his long-term goals. Caesar's political reforms were sweeping and often ahead of their time. He tackled debt relief, reorganized the courts, restructured the calendar, expanded citizenship, and implemented measures to combat corruption. Many of these changes stabilized Rome in ways the Senate had failed to achieve. His vision extended beyond immediate crises. He imagined a Rome capable of integrating its vast territories rather than merely ruling them through force. Critics argued that his methods were dictatorial, and indeed they were, but they were also effective. Caesar understood that Rome's political system was collapsing under its own weight, and that decisive action was necessary. What set Caesar apart from other politicians was his ability to communicate directly with the people. Through public speeches, lavish games, and even carefully crafted writings, he shaped his own narrative. He portrayed himself as a champion of the masses, a reformer fighting against aristocratic corruption. This image did not always reflect the full truth, but it was powerful. People adored him because he made them feel seen, valued, and included in Rome's future. His political genius lay in blending charisma with practical governance, idealism with ambition, and public service with personal advantage. Ultimately, Caesar's political influence outlived his body. His policies laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire. The Senate he reshaped became the Senate Augustus inherited. The calendar he reformed still governs daily life across the modern world. Even the title Caesar would echo for millennia, adopted by emperors, kings, and conquerors across continents. As a politician, Caesar did not merely navigate the currents of power, he fundamentally reshaped them. Caesar the myth, how history rewrote a man. In death, Julius Caesar became more than a historical figure, he became a myth. His story was shaped, retold, distorted, and exalted by generations who projected their own desires and fears onto his memory. Ancient writers painted Caesar as everything from a tyrant thirsty for power to a hero tragically cut down by jealous aristocrats. The duality of his legacy reflects a larger truth. Caesar was too large, too complex, too transformative, to fit neatly into any single narrative. His life embodied the tensions between order and chaos, ambition and duty, reform and domination. Shakespeare immortalized him as the doomed ruler whose fall warned audiences against unchecked ambition. Medieval scholars saw him as the ideal monarch, wise, decisive, courageous. Renaissance thinkers admired him as the epitome of classical leadership. Napoleon carried Caesar's commentaries into battle. Mussolini plastered his name across Italy. Every generation reshaped Caesar according to its own values. The conspirators who killed him dreamed of being remembered as liberators, but history had other plans. Caesar's myth eclipsed them entirely, turning their act of liberation into an eternal symbol of betrayal. The transformation of Caesar into myth was fueled not just by storytellers, but by Rome itself. The empire built by Augustus relied heavily on Caesar's legacy to legitimize its own authority. Augustus portrayed himself as the continuer of Caesar's vision, the avenger of his legacy, and the protector of his divine lineage. Statues, temples, coins, and festivals ensured Caesar remained ever-present in Roman consciousness. Over time, the real man, flawed, charismatic, brilliant, manipulative, faded beneath layers of symbolism. The myth of Caesar endures because it captures human contradictions. Greatness born from ambition, tragedy born from success, immortality born from mortality. His life reads like a tragic epic, his death like the climax of a Shakespearean drama. In myth, Caesar became eternal, a symbol of power, leadership, and the high cost of ambition. The eternal legacy, how Julius Caesar created the modern world. To understand the modern world, one must understand Julius Caesar. His influence extends far beyond the ancient Mediterranean, shaping political systems, military doctrines, legal frameworks, and even language. The very concept of centralized leadership, embodied in emperors, kings, presidents, traces its lineage to Caesar's concentration of power. His reforms stabilized the Roman Republic long enough for Augustus to transform it into the Roman Empire, which in turn shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia. Caesar's writings influenced education, rhetoric, and strategy throughout history. Military academies still study his Gallic campaigns. His calendar reformation remains the backbone of global timekeeping. His political maneuvers, alliances, and public relations strategies form the foundation of modern statecraft. Even his name became a title, Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar, echoing across continents and centuries, symbolizing supreme authority. But perhaps Caesar's most profound legacy lies in the idea of leadership he embodied. He was a man who believed in destiny, who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be reshaped by willpower. His victories redefined Rome's borders. His vision redefined its identity. Whether viewed as hero or villain, Caesar stands as a monumental figure whose life altered the trajectory of history. His rise showed the heights of human ambition. His fall revealed its dangers. Yet his legacy, vast, complex, and indelible, continues to shape nations, inspire leaders, and captivate imaginations. Julius Caesar did not simply change Rome. He created the world that followed, a world still living in the shadow of his legacy. As the final echoes of Caesar's footsteps fade into the ruins of history, we're left with a truth as old as Rome itself. Greatness always comes with a cost. We have traveled through wars, betrayals, passions, victories, and the slow collapse of a republic under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the center of it all, one man, driven by destiny, daring to reshape a world that feared him. In Caesar's rise, we saw the unstoppable momentum of ambition. In his fall, we witnessed the fragility of power, how even the mightiest can be undone by a few trembling hands in a moment of fear. Yet his death was not an ending, but a beginning. The republic he tried to control exploded into chaos. The empire he never got to rule rose from the ashes of his blood. And today, thousands of years later, his shadow is still here, etched into our languages. Our laws, our calendar, our politics, and our understanding of leadership itself. Caesar may have died on the Senate floor, but Julius Caesar, the idea never did. So as we close this journey, remember this. History isn't just written by the victors. It's shaped by those bold enough to challenge the world they're born into. and Caesar was nothing if not bold. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest figures, like the video. It helps more people discover long-form history content like this. Now I want to hear from you. Was Caesar a hero who saved Rome, or a tyrant who destroyed it? Subscribe plus turn on notifications, share the video. If you know someone who loves Rome, warfare, ancient history, or political drama, send this their way. History lives when we share it.